I've waited for 60 years to say something. Darkly brown, the whole thing. A little dementia. You get dementia once in a while. I still exercise. I go to the gym, and I think that has something to do with keep moving. The older you get, the more important it is.
In the world of American entertainment, where fame often comes with bitter sacrifices, Dick Van Dyke stands as a living paradox. He is remembered as the bringer of laughter, the artist who could turn clumsy falls into classic moments, the man who charmed audiences with Mary Poppins, Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, and the Dick Van Dyke Show. But few realize that behind his optimistic demeanor and radiant smile lies a life haunted by family tragedies. He once drank himself into oblivion just to mask his innate shyness, smoked 3 packs of cigarettes a day until his lungs were shredded, sank into depression, and even admitted there were times he thought of giving it all up. He endured a broken marriage, a long and tearful love story that ended with the death of his partner from illness, and the unbearable grief of losing his beloved granddaughter to a rare syndrome. Behind the bright smile were wounds that never truly healed. Now, approaching 100, he still sings, still dances, still carries within him an indomitable spirit, as if to remind audiences that laughter never dies. It is this resilience that has bound his name not only to glory, but also to proof of the strength of a soul shattered many times yet never defeated. How could a man who so often faced the shadows, from the secrets of his birth to the illness that drove him to despair, transform it all into a radiant legacy of joy and laughter? To understand how he weathered so many storms and still shone, we must return to the beginning. To a shy little boy growing up in a family full of secrets, carrying silent wounds from childhood. From there, the journey of Dick Van Dyke, both dazzling and bittersweet, truly began. Dick Van Dyke was born on December 13, 1925 in West Plains, Missouri. But from the very moment of his birth, fate had already marked him with the first scar. His parents concealed the fact that he had been conceived out of wedlock, a shameful stigma in the 1920s America. To protect the family's honor, they altered the records and let Dick grow up believing he was born in 1926. It wasn't until he was 18, holding his real birth certificate in his hands, that he discovered he had lived his entire youth under a lie. That seemingly small secret left a deep imprint. If even his own birthday had been hidden, what in life could he ever truly be certain of? Soon after, the Van Dyke family moved to Danville, Illinois, a small industrial town yet fertile ground for talent. In Dick's class were Donald O'Connor, later famous for Singin' in the Rain, and jazz musician Bobby Short. Even Gene Hackman grew up in the same community. But for Dick, childhood in Danville was defined more by emptiness than opportunity. His father, Loren, a traveling salesman for the Sunshine Cookie Company, was often away from home. His mother, Hazel, a stenographer, juggled raising children with keeping the household from falling apart. In that house, Dick grew up with a constant longing for his absent father, and shyness became the invisible wall enclosing his youth. That loneliness drew Dick to the church. At the time, young Van Dyke believed he would one day become a Presbyterian minister. He taught Sunday school, read the Bible, performed good deeds, and held on to the dream of saving souls. Yet destiny handed him a different calling. When he joined the drama club at Danville High School, Dick realized the stage could offer something the church never could: freedom. There, the shy boy could transform into a lively character. The clumsy one could become the bringer of laughter. Most importantly, the stage gave him the rarest gift of all: acceptance. Alongside church and drama club came his first steps as a radio announcer at a local station. His warm voice and quick wit soon helped the lanky teenager find his place. But what few knew was that even then, Dick was battling fear. He was so timid around strangers that when he had to speak in public, his hands shook uncontrollably. That shyness haunted his youth, and later in life he turned to alcohol as the only way to untie himself. In 1944, as World War II reached its fiercest stage, Dick Van Dyke decided to drop out of high school and enlist. It was not only a civic duty, but also a desperate desire to prove himself, that the skinny, timid boy from Danville could do something meaningful. But on his very first medical exam, Dick faced a private humiliation. His body betrayed him. Standing 6 feet 1 inch but weighing only 135 pounds, he looked more like a fragile schoolboy than a soldier. The Army doctors shook their heads and struck his name from the list. Undeterred, Dick tried again and failed again. At 19, he understood that in the eyes of the military, he was too frail to carry a weapon, too fragile to stand in the ranks. But at that moment, the stubborn streak hidden beneath his shy exterior surfaced. On his third attempt, Dick stuffed himself with bananas and drank as much water as he could to temporarily increase his weight. The scale tipped just enough, and he was finally accepted. It was a small victory, but a significant one. At the very least, he would get to wear the uniform instead of returning home in shame. Yet the war did not send him to the front lines as he had imagined. Instead of carrying a rifle, Dick was assigned to the Special Services Unit, where soldiers did not fight, but sang, danced, and performed to ease the fears of others. At first, he was disappointed, feeling as though he'd been denied the chance to sacrifice like his comrades. But on those makeshift stages, under the roar of laughter and the shining eyes of soldiers just back from the trenches, Dick realized something profound. Laughter could save lives too, no less than bullets or artillery. It was during those years touring with the unit that he learned to face his stage fright, strengthened his voice, trained his body's agility, and above all, discovered the power of joy in the darkest moments. That was the first school destiny had chosen for him, not one that gave diplomas, but one that provided the most precious lesson of all, the ability to use laughter to heal wounds. A lesson that would carry him through the next 7 decades of his life. In 1946, Dick Van Dyke left the military with a Good Conduct Medal, a modest award, yet deeply meaningful. It was proof that he had given his all in his role, even if it wasn't on the front lines. Returning to civilian life, Van Dyke immediately faced a new challenge, finding a place in post-war America. He tried his hand at advertising, a booming industry at the time, full of promises of creativity and prestige. But it didn't take long for him to discover that he loathed it. The hollow slogans and empty language repelled him. For a man who believed that laughter must spring from truth, advertising felt like nothing more than a false mask. Turning in a different direction, Dick found an unlikely ally, Phil Erickson, a mime artist. Together they formed the Merry Mutes, a comedy act built on pantomime and lip-sync routines to 78 RPM records. It was the kind of silly entertainment that seemed frivolous but had audiences roaring with laughter. The two young men toured the West Coast, later expanding to Atlanta and New Orleans. Those small stages and makeshift venues became his second school, where Van Dyke honed his control over body movement, timing, and comic rhythm. Skills that would later make him shine on television and Broadway. Alongside stage work, Van Dyke began building a career in local radio and television. Back in Danville, he worked as a DJ for WDAN, writing his own scripts, cracking jokes, and hosting music programs. His warm voice and natural delivery quickly made him a familiar figure to listeners. He later moved to New Orleans, then Atlanta, continuing as an MC and actor for local TV shows. Those years did not yet bring fame, but they laid the foundation for his career. Years in which a young artist learned to endure failure, cultivate patience, and above all, survive with the conviction that laughter would be his salvation. After years of grinding through radio jobs and small stages, the true turning point arrived in 1954. Dick Van Dyke was invited to appear on the program Chance of a Lifetime. It sounded like a golden opportunity, But for a man who had spent his whole life terrified of audiences, it felt more like a death sentence. Just moments before stepping out, he panicked and ran to the bathroom, ready to flee. Only a hurried swig of alcohol gave him the courage to stagger back. Then fate intervened. The microphone cord accidentally wrapped around his leg, turning his performance into an impromptu slapstick sketch. The audience erupted in laughter, and Van Dyke was stunned to realize his clumsiness, his very fear, could be transformed into art. From that near escape, on chance of a lifetime, Dick Van Dyke learned one of his greatest lessons. Mistakes weren't enemies, but opportunities to reveal his true self. And just a year later, he would prove it on national television. In 1955, CBS invited Van Dyke to co-host The Morning Show, seated alongside none other than Walter Cronkite, the most serious anchor in America. For most people, this would have been a dream leap forward. For Van Dyke, it felt like plunging into an abyss. Anxiety nearly paralyzed him, and by the third broadcast, disaster struck. As he moved across the studio, he tripped on a cable, sending the entire lighting rig crashing down. Chaos erupted, and everyone braced for a career-ending catastrophe. But Van Dyke didn't run. Instead, he turned the accident into a bit of comic improvisation. He staggered, bulged his eyes, raised his hands as if controlling the falling lights, all in a matter of seconds. The studio audience burst into laughter, and viewers at home believed it was a planned routine. For the first time, Van Dyke realized audiences didn't want perfection. They wanted authenticity, and the truest thing about him was his clumsy falls. From that moment, he was no longer just the host CBS had hired. He became the golden improviser, the man who could turn mishaps into comedy. His name began appearing more often on American television. He landed spots on The Phil Silvers Show, 1957, then The Pat Boone Chevy Showroom, and The Polly Bergen Show. His roles were minor, sometimes just a few minutes on screen, but audiences remembered his face because his awkwardness and fumbling had become his charm. While many actors polished themselves to appear flawless, Van Dyke chose to tumble before the world, then rise again with a smile. In 1959, Broadway opened its doors. He was cast in the musical Girls Against the Boys. For Van Dyke, it was a dream come true, his name in a legitimate Broadway program for the first time. But the dream quickly turned into a nightmare. The production folded after only 16 performances due to poor ticket sales. The blow sent Van Dyke crashing back to square one. Years of effort seemed to have yielded nothing but humiliation. And yet, in that bitter failure, destiny reached out again. As Van Dyke was struggling to find his next step, he was invited to audition for a new musical titled Bye Bye Birdie. He had no idea this would be the doorway to the spotlight, transforming the awkward, shy man into Broadway's brightest new star of the early 1960s. In April 1960, Bye Bye Birdie premiered. Van Dyke played Albert Peterson, a shy, bumbling, yet earnest character. The role seemed written just for him. No accidental microphone cords, no collapsing lights. This time, audiences laughed and cried because he truly touched their hearts. Just 1 year later, Van Dyke stood on the stage of triumph, accepting the 1961 Tony Award for Best Featured Actor in a Musical. From the boy who once hid trembling in a bathroom, he had become a Broadway star. And that was also the key that opened the door to television, where the name Dick Van Dyke would step into legend. After Bye Bye Birdie, Broadway had given Dick Van Dyke a star, but it was television that made him an icon for an entire generation. In 1961, he stepped into what seemed like a small role, Rob Petrie, a comedy writer. But on the small screen, that character wasn't just writing scripts. He was rewriting the very history of American sitcoms. Alongside Mary Tyler Moore, his young, smart, and graceful on-screen wife, Van Dyke created a couple that was both funny and real. For the first time, American audiences saw a TV family that could argue, love, worry about their children, and then laugh together over the clumsy moments of everyday life. In a country tense with the Cold War and social upheaval, the Dick Van Dyke Show offered escape, satirizing office life while soothing viewers with warm family moments. And then, a single stumble changed everything. In the opening credits, Rob dashes into the living room, trips over the ottoman, and crashes to the floor. Originally just an improvised choice during rehearsal, it became a cultural touchstone. Each week, audiences tuned in, wondering, would he clear it this time or fall again? It wasn't just a gag. It was his life in miniature, a clumsy man turning a fall into laughter, mistakes into magic. Success followed success. 15 Emmy Awards, 3 times Van Dyke walked away with the statuette for Best Actor. But behind the lights, he drank to cope with his shyness, stumbling onto set with a swaying body, turning that very unsteadiness into an artistic style. Viewers loved him because they thought he was happy, when in truth, he was falling, both literally and figuratively. Yet perhaps that was exactly what made Rob Petrie a character for the ages. The Dick Van Dyke Show not only defined the modern sitcom, it made a timid, alcoholic man the beating heart of America. Having secured his name on Broadway and television, Hollywood quickly opened its doors to Dick Van Dyke. But as always in his life, light came paired with shadow. In 1963, he reprised Bye Bye Birdie in its film adaptation. It should have been his moment to reaffirm his stage triumph. But fate mocked him. To cater to younger audiences, the studio shifted the spotlight to Anne Margaret, shrinking Van Dyke's central role as Albert Peterson, the very part he had built. He was openly disappointed, even felt betrayed, and yet the film was a box office hit. Audiences still laughed, still loved him. Once again, he understood. Even if pushed out of the spotlight, as long as laughter remained, he endured. Then, in 1964, Van Dyke took on the role that would forever define him, Bert in Mary Poppins. A cheerful chimney sweep dancing with animated penguins, singing alongside Julie Andrews, every moment became iconic. But few know that to secure a second part as the elderly banker Mr. Dawes Sr., Van Dyke donated $4,000 to Walt Disney's CalArts Fund. He half joked, half lamented, "I offered to do it for free, and somehow I ended up paying to be in it." That pride, however, carried a stain that would never wash away. His Cockney accent in Mary Poppins was considered disastrous, often ranked in polls as one of the worst accents in film history. Van Dyke later laughed at himself, saying he found it just as funny as the audience did when he heard it again. In that humiliation, though, there was light. Children never cared about accents. They only remembered a charming Bert who danced with penguins. That memory saved him from ridicule and kept Bert alive as a part of countless childhoods. In 1968, he starred in Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. The film flopped in American theaters, but strangely, Britain embraced it, and it became a beloved cult classic tied to the childhood of millions. It proved that failure in one place didn't mean failure everywhere, just like Van Dyke's own life, where a stumble in one moment could become a lift in another. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, as his career entered a new stage, Dick Van Dyke no longer sought only lighthearted, funny roles. He began gravitating toward heavier characters, ones that reflected the shadows within himself. In 1969, the comic was released. Van Dyke played Billy Bright, a legendary silent film comedian who once had everything but lost it all to alcohol and self-destruction. Watching him on screen, audiences felt a chill. He was no longer merely pretending to spiral into drunken ruin. He was living out his own torment. The scenes of Billy stumbling drunk under stage lights or staring blankly into a mirror were indistinguishable from Van Dyke himself, drinking every day to silence his shyness, slowly losing himself. The film failed commercially, but for Van Dyke, it was a brutal mirror of truth. He could no longer escape himself through roles. 2 years later, in 1971, he stunned audiences again with Cold Turkey. This time, instead of delving into personal pain, Van Dyke turned his satire outward, mocking America itself. The film painted a biting picture of a small town joining a contest to quit smoking in exchange for a fortune. The comedy wasn't the slapstick falls of the Dick Van Dyke Show, but a sharp, caustic laugh, exposing how people were willing to sacrifice health, love, and reason in pursuit of money and fame. Van Dyke laughed, but it was a cold laugh, laying bare a society riddled with contradictions. It was during this period that people began to see the truth. Behind the image of the man who brought the world laughter, Van Dyke was revealing his real darkness. He no longer hid the fact that he drank for courage, smoked 3 packs a day to fill the void. The comic and Cold Turkey were like two sides of the same mirror. One showed his self-destruction, the other mocked the society he lived in. But together, they revealed the same bitter truth. Humor was only a fragile mask, stretched thin over wounds that would never heal. After Cold Turkey, Dick Van Dyke entered a daring but conflicted phase. In 1971, he agreed to star in the new Dick Van Dyke Show. Audiences expected him to recreate the magic of the 1960s, but this time, he chose a different path. His sitcom touched on thorny social issues rather than simply chasing laughs. Viewers, however, weren't ready. After 3 seasons, 1971 to 1974, the show ended in disappointment. For Van Dyke, it was a bitter lesson. Audiences don't always want the truth laid bare. That same year, he poured his soul into The Morning After, playing an alcoholic man in self-destruction. Critics and viewers were stunned. This wasn't just a role, it was a public confession. Van Dyke embodied himself so completely that many felt they were witnessing his daily struggle in real life. The role earned him an Emmy nomination, but for Van Dyke, the accolade mattered less than the fact that, for the first time, he dared to face his own darkness head-on. Also, in 1974, he guest-starred in Columbo, playing a murderer. It was another shock. The man who brought laughter now wore the mask of a cold-blooded killer. Van Dyke deliberately challenged both the audience and himself by breaking away entirely from his innocent, bumbling image, proving he could do far more than pratfalls. In 1976, he returned with Van Dyke and Company, a variety sketch comedy show where he gave chances to new faces. It was here that an odd name first appeared before audiences, Andy Kaufman. Though the program won an Emmy, it was canceled after only 11 episodes. That fleeting success mirrored Van Dyke's television career after his golden years, brilliant in flashes but fading quickly. But Van Dyke never stopped. After decades of ups and downs, he made a surprise comeback in his 60s with Diagnosis, Murder, 1993 to 2001. In the series, he played Dr. Mark Sloan, a man both intelligent and compassionate, who also solved baffling crimes. The show was a huge success, running 8 seasons, and it became a family bridge. His son Barry Van Dyke played Sloan's son. For viewers, each episode was a mystery to solve. For Van Dyke, it was a chapter of healing, working alongside his son, recreating the sense of family he had so often lost in real life. After Diagnosis, Murder ended, he continued with the TV movie series Murder 101, 2006, again with Barry. These films didn't shake the media, but they proved Van Dyke had found simple joy, working with family without needing overwhelming glory. His later film career also held memorable moments. In 1990, he played a villainous prosecutor in Dick Tracy, again shattering his gentle image. In 2006, he appeared in Night at the Museum alongside Ben Stiller, surprising young audiences with the magnetism of an old man who still had it. And in 2018, Van Dyke returned in Mary Poppins Returns, this time as Mr. Dawes Jr., a deeply moving tribute to a journey that had begun more than half a century earlier. From legendary sitcoms to villainous roles, from on-screen family warmth to real-life stumbles, Van Dyke proved one thing. He was not just an entertainer, but a survivor. A man who could be reborn after every fall. Even as the stage lights illuminated Dick Van Dyke's name, his private life remained a tangle of love, sacrifice, and fracture. The first chapter of his married life began with what seemed like a simple romance. Margie Willett, the woman who had been by his side since his youth, long before the world knew the name Van Dyke. They met in Danville, Illinois, when Van Dyke was still a young man with no clear path in his career. Margie was not a star, nor a dancer, nor an actress. She came from an ordinary family and lived humbly, simply. It was precisely that honesty, straightforwardness, and sense of safety that drew Van Dyke in, a boy raised amid secrets and uncertainty, finding in Margie the anchor he had always lacked. In 1948, despite financial struggles, they decided to marry. Their wedding did not take place in a grand church or a lavish hotel, but on the live radio program Bride and Groom in New York, a show that invited poor couples to wed on air, covering the expenses and offering gifts in place of dowries. For Van Dyke, that wedding was both joy and sorrow. It marked the start of their life together, but also revealed how little they had, to the point of relying on media just to have a proper ceremony. In the early years of marriage, they had 4 children: Christian, Barry, Stacy, and Carrie Beth. Van Dyke was then juggling jobs as a DJ, variety performer, and slowly transitioning into television. Margie became the backbone of the family, carrying nearly all the domestic responsibilities while her husband chased his artistic dream. Behind the glamorous stage lay a home weighed down by burdens, raising young children, stretching every dollar, while Van Dyke grew increasingly absent under the demands of touring and production schedules. The deepest strain came from Van Dyke's own inner demons. He drank more and more, first for courage to face the stage, then out of habit, until it consumed him. Margie watched her witty, joyful husband turn into a brooding man, at times sinking so deep he could no longer control his emotions. She too battled her own darkness, depression that required repeated treatment. 2 wounded souls shared the same home, but instead of healing each other, they unintentionally pushed one another further apart. For decades, their marriage was a tug-of-war without end. Love still present, yet buried beneath disagreements and pain. Van Dyke later admitted, "Margie and I were too different. We tried to hold on for the children, but in the end, we only hurt each other more." In 1984, after 36 years together, they divorced. The separation not only closed a long chapter, but also left Van Dyke with lasting regret. He had once possessed a complete family, yet it was his own mistakes that led to its collapse. His love with Margie Willett was neither glamorous nor extravagant, but it shaped his years of growing into adulthood. It gave him 4 children, but also taught him the harsh cost of fame and the silent destruction of addiction. It was a love story that began in hope, but ended in wounds carried by them both, wounds that Van Dyke bore with him until the very end of his life. After his broken marriage with Margie Willett, Dick Van Dyke seemed as though he would close the chapter on love, but fate led him to Michelle Triola, an experienced actress and singer who would remain by his side for more than 3 decades. They met in the mid-1970s, when Van Dyke was struggling to pull himself out of the spiral of alcoholism and the anguish of divorce. Michelle, who had once made headlines for suing actor Lee Marvin in the landmark Palimony case, was a woman who understood loss and pain all too well. She was not only a lover but also a companion, someone patient and strong enough to enter the life of a man stumbling through his darkest years. From 1976, they moved in together. Michelle became Van Dyke's emotional anchor, helping him stabilize, control his addictions, and keep their home filled with laughter. Yet happiness was never entirely smooth. Van Dyke often admitted that he carried a deep sense of guilt, still bound to his old family, to children scarred by divorce, while at the same time beginning a new life. Michelle endured whispers and judgment, labeled by many as the other woman, the shadow said to have disrupted his family. And yet, despite public opinion, they remained together for nearly 30 years. Michelle often appeared at Van Dyke's side at events, quietly standing in the background of his spotlight. She cared for him during his bouts of depression, pushed him toward rehab, and was the one who witnessed his despair when he confessed there were moments he had thought of giving up entirely. Van Dyke once said, "If it weren't for Michelle, I probably wouldn't still be standing on stage." But tragedy struck again. In 2007, Michelle was diagnosed with lung cancer. Van Dyke, already in his 80s, devoted himself to her care, managing her medication, tending to every small detail, and staying by her side until the very end. He later shared that watching Michelle in pain made him feel utterly helpless, as though a part of himself was slowly slipping away. In 2009, Michelle passed away, leaving Van Dyke with a void that could never be filled. Her death was not only the loss of a partner, but also a deep fracture in Van Dyke's heart. The man who had long been the bearer of laughter now had to learn to live with silence and loneliness. In later interviews, he still spoke of Michelle with wistful eyes, as though she had never truly left his life. If his marriage with Margie Willett left wounds from rupture, then his love with Michelle Triola taught Van Dyke the meaning of sacrifice and the kind of pain that no one can mend in the face of illness. These two great loves, one that began with hope but ended in divorce, the other sustained by devotion but cut short by death, shaped the scarred heart he carried for the rest of his life. After all the losses, it seemed Dick Van Dyke would spend the rest of his life in solitude until an unexpected turning point arrived. In 2012, at the age of 86, he married Arlene Silver, a makeup artist 46 years his junior. Almost immediately, the marriage became the subject of media scrutiny and public debate. Many called it an unequal match, a late-life patchwork, and some claimed Van Dyke was merely seeking care in old age, while Arlene was accused of exploiting the fame of a Hollywood legend. The nearly half-century age gap was hard for many to accept. Certain articles even likened their bond to that of grandfather and granddaughter, harshly criticizing Van Dyke for being guided by age and status, rather than genuine love. But reality proved entirely different. Those close to him admitted that Arlene brought Van Dyke a new chapter, gentle, simple, and refreshing. They first met in 2006, when Silver was handling makeup at the SAG Awards. Van Dyke was 80 at the time, while Silver was in her early 30s. Instead of being dazzled by his fame, she was charmed by his wit, mischief, and surprisingly youthful energy. 6 years later, they were married in a private ceremony on a Malibu beach. The suspicions of using his fame gradually faded as the public witnessed how devoted they were, singing together, dancing together, appearing at events with eyes full of affection. Arlene encouraged him to maintain an active lifestyle, urged him to exercise, and even joined him in making playful videos for social media, proof that their love was neither contrived nor forced. Van Dyke once confessed, "She makes me forget about age. I'm not 86 or 96. I'm just a man in love." Since their marriage, Van Dyke and Arlene have appeared publicly at countless events. They have sung duets, danced, and even entertained audiences with lighthearted online videos, becoming living proof that love can transcend judgment. For Arlene, he was no longer a Hollywood legend, but simply a man in need of care, understanding, and companionship. If Michelle Triola had once been his anchor during the darkest years, then Arlene Silver became the light at the end of the road, helping Van Dyke find simple happiness as he neared a century of life. Amid loss, illness, and sorrowful memories, he still chose to love, to trust, and to dance, as if time itself could never conquer his heart. Even though Arlene Silver brought Dick Van Dyke a breath of fresh air in his twilight years, his past remained marked by shadows that could not be easily erased. Before he could hold the hand of his young wife in peace, Van Dyke endured decades tormented by addiction and depression. It all began with shyness. Van Dyke had always been a reserved young man, too timid to strike up conversations with strangers. When he entered show business, he turned to alcohol as a social crutch, a bit of liquid courage to lower his guard. But what began as medicine quickly became poison. From one martini for bravery, he climbed to 3 or 4 glasses a night. Alcohol transformed bashfulness into boisterousness. But when the night ended, it left behind abysses of despair. He sank deeper into depression, at times so hopeless that he thought of ending it all. In 1972, Van Dyke was forced into rehab. He admitted candidly, "Alcoholism is no different from heroin. It takes everything from you." Yet even then, breaking free was no easy path. He relapsed many times, stumbled many times, until his body itself began to reject alcohol. Every sip brought only nausea and dizziness. Van Dyke called that moment a miracle. The first time he could look life in the face without leaning on drink as a crutch. But alcohol was only one of many burdens he bore. Family tragedies struck relentlessly. In 1987, his 13-year-old granddaughter Jessica died of Ray's syndrome, a rare condition that can arise after taking aspirin during chickenpox. The sudden death cut deeply into the heart of a grandfather who had always seen family as his refuge after so many other losses. Then, one by one, the important women in his life were taken away. In 2008, Margie Willett, the wife of his youth who had stood by him through the hardest years, died of pancreatic cancer. Just a year later, Michelle Triola, his longtime partner of more than 3 decades, succumbed to lung cancer. Van Dyke described that moment with haunting words. "The hardest role I ever played was pretending to hope in front of her, when I already knew the truth." Even before grief could subside, disaster loomed again. In 2013, while driving his Jaguar on the 101 freeway, the car suddenly burst into flames. Van Dyke was pulled out by a passerby just moments before the fire consumed the vehicle. Hours later, he joked on Twitter, "Used Jaguar for sale, cheap." A lighthearted quip, but behind it was the stark reality. He had barely escaped death. His body was no less tormented. For decades, Van Dyke smoked up to 3 packs a day. The cruel habit left him with severe consequences: pneumonia, and at one point, a collapsed lung. As if that were not enough, he endured 7 years of a strange condition, hearing his heart beating in his head whenever he lay down. He went from hospital to hospital with no answers. Only after he complained on Twitter did a follower suggest it might be due to titanium dental implants. Tests confirmed it. The vibrations from the implants had been tormenting him all those years. All of these ordeals, addiction, depression, the deaths of loved ones, and layers of illness, wove a private life steeped in darkness, in stark contrast to the image of the smiling entertainer on stage. Van Dyke once said, "People think I bring laughter. But what they don't know is that laughter is what saved me from myself." But perhaps the greatest miracle of Dick Van Dyke's life is not how many times he stumbled, but how he always stood back up and turned those very falls into part of his artistic legacy. In an industry where every eye is trained on perfection, Van Dyke taught audiences that laughter does not come from polished scripts, but from authenticity, from a spontaneous slip, from a bewildered glance, from a man unafraid to expose his own clumsiness. The Dick Van Dyke Show changed the face of the American sitcom, pioneering a new form of storytelling, blending family and work, bringing everyday life onto television. The image of Rob Petrie tripping over the ottoman became a cultural symbol, so iconic that each generation recognizes it, even if they've never watched a full episode. Then came Mary Poppins, where he left behind a role both innocent and magical, allowing generations of children around the world to grow up with Bert's smile. Van Dyke was not only an entertainer, but also a source of life inspiration for millions. He walked through the darkness of addiction and depression, then openly shared his story. By admitting his weakness, he gave courage to those silently battling their own addictions and mental struggles. He showed that even the man who brought joy to the world could collapse, but more importantly, he could rise again. His legacy is not confined to 3 Emmy Awards, a Tony, or his legendary film roles. It lives in the way audiences remember him as a friend in every home, someone who gave them a sense of safety through laughter and as a model of resilience. Even at the very end, nearing 100, he still sang, still danced, still left the world astonished. How could a heart fractured so many times still beat with such joy? Dick Van Dyke was not just the man who knew how to fall gracefully. He was living proof that even in the most tragic of lives, one can plant the seeds of joy and let them blossom into an eternal legacy for humanity. When many thought he would close out his journey in silence, Dick Van Dyke continued to astonish the world. At nearly 100, he did not retreat from the spotlight, but seemed to treat the stage as his final refuge. In 2024, he became the oldest artist ever to win a Daytime Emmy for his guest role in Days of Our Lives, and was then honored again at the Primetime Emmy Awards with the special Dick Van Dyke, 98 Years of Magic. These 2 records were not just accolades, but reminders that the joy he had given the world was far from exhausted. But no human body lasts forever. In September 2024, he was forced to cancel an appearance at the FanX Salt Lake Comic Convention and missed the Emmy ceremony, causing worry among fans. When reporters caught him strolling in Malibu, Van Dyke only smiled. "I really do feel old now," but then added, as if to reassure everyone, "Hopefully, I'll still make it to my 99th birthday." At an age when most of his peers had long since passed, his very presence had become a living legacy, and that presence itself was a miracle. As 2025 began, Dick Van Dyke was 99, preparing to touch the milestone of 100, a number he once joked was hard to believe. At an age when almost anyone else would withdraw from public life, Van Dyke still made headlines, not merely as a relic of the past, but as a vivid testament to the endurance of an artist's spirit. In March, he surprised everyone by appearing with the a cappella group The Fantastics at a wildfire relief fundraiser in Malibu. In a hall filled with emotion, he still sang Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, still cracked jokes with the crowd, still left the image of an artist who refused to tire. For him, singing was not just performance, it was resistance against the erosion of time. At 99, Van Dyke still maintained a gym routine 3 times a week: yoga, stretching, and sometimes lightweight exercises. Each movement like a declaration that this body, once battered by cigarettes, alcohol, and illness, had not yet surrendered. He called it the secret to keeping laughter alive longer than life itself. Yet 2025 also brought harsh trials. When the Palisades fire spread across California, Van Dyke and Arlene Silver had to evacuate urgently. He later recalled with striking calm, "I thought, maybe this is the end. But then I remembered I still had a show to do." That serenity only deepened the public's affection, because with Van Dyke, tragedy always came paired with a smile. He also stirred excitement with news of upcoming projects. Alongside host Tom Bergeron and his wife Arlene, he teased a new production, details withheld, but proof he still yearned to create. At the same time, Van Dyke prepared to release a new memoir where he planned to write about his battles with addiction, loss, and the hidden realities of aging. Strangely, though he had been tied to audiences for 8 decades, Van Dyke confessed that only in his later years did he receive more fan letters than during his prime. Most of them came from children, young souls who had never lived through the 1960s but were enthralled by Mary Poppins and Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. Kids watched them over and over, then write to me, he said in an interview, his eyes shining. For Van Dyke, that was proof that laughter never grows old. Today, in the warm home he shares with his young wife, Arlene Silver, he still sings, still exercises, sometimes even dances. Yet no one can deny the fragility of time. Each public appearance makes the world hold its breath, not only out of admiration for his vitality, but out of awareness that such moments are growing ever rarer. Dick Van Dyke, from the skinny boy who once stuffed himself with bananas to meet the Army's weight requirement, to the man in old age still dancing with faith in laughter, remains proof that a life may be filled with darkness, yet still blaze with brilliance. And perhaps his greatest legacy is not the awards, but his living presence, showing the world that laughter, when born of sincerity, outlives even time itself. For some people die and leave behind monuments. Others live a whole life and leave behind an aftertaste, the kind that makes us smile even as tears well up. Dick Van Dyke belongs to the latter. He does not need loud praise, only the quiet memory of someone replaying an old film on a lonely afternoon, then suddenly laughing. In that moment, he has triumphed over forgetting. For nearly a century, Van Dyke has been like a small but steady flame, casting light into the darkness of others. And perhaps that is the truest miracle, a man carrying so many wounds still strong enough to be medicine for someone else. If he ever made you laugh, if he ever warmed your heart, share that memory in the comments below, because perhaps your words will let Dick Van Dyke's laughter live once more, right here, among us. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so we can continue this journey of real and moving life stories together.